In the quiet, candle-lit rooms of Victorian England, where women wore corsets so tight they could barely breathe and the streets glowed under the soft light of gas lamps, there existed a peculiar illness. They called it hysteria. It was said to be a woman's disease, mysterious, unpredictable, and faintly scandalous. In those times, when emotions were seen as weaknesses and passion was a kind of rebellion, hysteria became the explanation for nearly every form of female behavior that men couldn't understand. If a woman was sad, she was hysterical. If she was angry, hysterical. If she spoke too much, too boldly, or too honestly, again, hysterical. The word itself came from the Greek hysteria, meaning uterus. Since ancient times, men believed that a woman's womb could wander through her body, disturbing her nerves, her mind, and her spirit. By the 1800s, this ancient superstition had found new life in the polished medical halls of Victorian London. Doctors and scholars wrote long, serious papers about this so-called female affliction. They described it as a condition caused by the restless energy of the female body, an imbalance of nerves, blood, and emotion. The symptoms were endless: fainting, anxiety, sleeplessness, irritability, and sometimes, simply boredom. To them, hysteria wasn't just a sickness of the body, it was proof that women were delicate, unstable, and in need of male guidance. And so, thousands of women across Europe and America were diagnosed. They were the wives of merchants, the daughters of scholars, and the mothers of children. Women who lived quiet lives behind lace curtains, forbidden from education, work, or desire. Their minds were caged, their spirits restless, and their bodies misunderstood. When their sadness or frustration became too visible, the doctors arrived, stethoscopes hanging from their necks, confident and certain. They would listen, take notes, and announce the same thing: "You are suffering from hysteria." The cure, they said, was simple, but it was unlike anything modern medicine would ever accept today. These physicians believed that hysteria was caused by congestion in the womb, a buildup of fluid and tension that needed to be released. And the method of release was called a pelvic massage. Yes, these treatments were done by doctors. The idea was that a manual massage would bring about what they termed a hysterical paroxysm, in other words, an orgasm. To the Victorians, it wasn't sexual, it was purely medical. The woman would lie back, and the doctor would begin. After a time, sometimes long, sometimes short, the patient would tremble, breathe deeply, and finally relax. The doctor would smile and declare the treatment successful. In that dimly lit office, between the doctor's hands and the patient's quiet sighs, something extraordinary was happening, though neither truly understood it, because while society thought it was curing women of their emotions, it was actually allowing them, for the first time, to feel them. But there was a problem: the process was exhausting. Doctors began to complain that the therapy took too long, sometimes an hour or more. Their hands would ache, their schedules overrun with women needing treatment, and so, one doctor decided to solve the problem. His name was Joseph Mortimer Granville, and he invented a device to help speed up the process. He called it Granville's hammer. He claimed it was meant for muscle pain, for tension, for scientific relief, but other physicians quickly saw its potential for their hysterical patients. Soon, Granville's invention was quietly used in clinics across London, and by the end of the century, the device began appearing in medical catalogs, sold to doctors, and eventually to women for home use. They called them personal massagers. They were advertised beside sewing machines and hair curlers. Respectable, domestic, and completely disguised. And yet, behind that disguise was something revolutionary. For the first time in history, women had a way to reclaim a part of themselves that had been shamed and suppressed. It was more than relief. It was awakening. In a world that called female pleasure a disease, these machines became silent instruments of liberation. Behind locked doors and lace curtains, women were quietly rediscovering their own power, though society refused to name it. The irony was almost poetic. The cure for hysteria, a condition created to control women, had become the key to their most private rebellion. As the years passed, the diagnosis began to fade. Doctors noticed that hysteria seemed to strike mainly the idle and the wealthy, women trapped in decorative cages, with no purpose but to please. When women began to work, to vote, to learn, and to live for themselves, hysteria mysteriously declined. It wasn't a medical miracle, it was freedom. The illness had never been real. What was real was the world's fear of women who refused to be silent. By the early 1900s, a new thinker emerged, Sigmund Freud. He believed hysteria was not physical but psychological, the result of repressed emotion and desire. For the first time, a man in medicine dared to say it. Perhaps it wasn't the body that was sick, but the society around it, and with that, the myth began to crumble. But even as hysteria disappeared from textbooks, its shadow remained. Women who spoke up were still called dramatic. Women in pain were told it was just in their heads, and women who felt too much, too deeply, were still labeled as emotional, unstable, or crazy. The ghost of hysteria still whispered in hospitals, in marriages, and in politics. Because the truth was never just about medicine, it was about control. Hysteria gave men the right to dismiss women's emotions, to make their suffering seem irrational, and their desires shameful. It turned humanity into weakness, and obedience into health. But history, as it always does, found its balance. The same society that tried to quiet women ended up giving them the very tools to reclaim themselves. And though the story feels absurd now, though we laugh at the idea of a wandering womb and the doctors who cured it, there is something haunting beneath the laughter. It's the echo of all those voices, dismissed and disbelieved. The countless women who sat in cold offices, told their feelings were sickness. The ones who wept quietly, not because they were weak, but because no one believed their pain was real. Their stories remind us how easy it is for power to disguise itself as concern, how quickly compassion can turn into control, and how long it can take to reclaim one's truth. Tonight, as you listen to this story and drift towards sleep, imagine the flicker of those old candles, the ticking of the clock, the rustle of silk dresses in a quiet parlor. Somewhere, a woman sits by the window. Outside, rain glides down the glass. She looks toward the gray sky and wonders if there is more to life than what she has been told. She's been called hysterical, emotional, unstable, but inside her heart burns something the doctors cannot measure, a quiet, steady awareness that she is not sick, she is simply unheard. And though the centuries have turned, that awareness lives on. Every woman who has been told to calm down, every woman whose pain was dismissed, every soul who has been labeled for feeling too deeply, they all carry the same message, the one the Victorians tried so hard to bury. That emotion is not madness, that passion is not sickness, and that the body, in all its mystery and power, has always known truths the world wasn't ready to hear. The story of hysteria is not only a medical curiosity, it is a mirror showing us how fear of emotion can twist compassion into control. It reminds us that progress begins when we stop labeling what we don't understand, and it reminds us that the cure was never a machine or a man in a white coat. The real cure was knowledge, understanding, freedom. So, as the fire fades and the sound of the night deepens, remember those forgotten women, the ones written out of history, their stories hidden beneath the word hysteria. They were not broken. They were not sick. They were simply waiting for the world to listen. And now, perhaps, at last, it has. The world eventually moved on from hysteria, but the story didn't really end. In truth, it simply changed shape, evolving into something subtler, quieter, harder to see. Even as women began to earn the right to vote, to study, and to work, the old ideas about emotion still lingered like invisible smoke. Doctors might have stopped using the word hysteria, but they often treated women the same way, as fragile creatures whose feelings were problems to be managed, not messages to be heard. A woman who wept after childbirth was told she was just tired. A woman in pain was told it was probably stress, and a woman who stood up for herself was often labeled difficult. The diagnosis had changed, but the disbelief remained. It was as if the ghost of hysteria still haunted the halls of modern medicine, whispering that emotion was weakness, that passion was instability, that control was health. For centuries, women's bodies had been described by men who never lived inside them, and their emotions, their cycles, their pain, all had been filtered through misunderstanding. It was easier to call them hysterical than to admit that science didn't yet understand them. But the truth, as always, was waiting to be rediscovered. As the 20th century unfolded, new generations of thinkers and healers began to see things differently. Psychologists started to understand that emotions are not diseases. They are languages, ways the body speaks when the mind cannot find words. Pain, sadness, anger, these were not signs of madness, but of meaning. Every tear carried a message, every silence held a truth. And yet, old habits die hard, even today. When women describe pain that doesn't show up on a scan, they're sometimes dismissed. Even today, when they say something feels wrong, they are told it's nothing serious, and even today, when they express deep emotion, they're called dramatic. The ghost of hysteria still lives, not in the textbooks, but in the small ways the world still teaches people to doubt their own feelings. It's there when a girl is told she's too emotional. It's there when a woman's anger is seen as unattractive. And it's there when softness, intuition, or empathy are treated as flaws instead of forms of wisdom. Hysteria may have been erased from medicine, but it survives in culture. Because it was never truly about the body. It was always about fear, the fear of feeling. The Victorians feared what they couldn't measure. They feared emotion because emotion meant unpredictability, and unpredictability meant loss of control. But control, a fragile thing. The more tightly society tried to bind women, through corsets, through silence, through diagnosis, the more cracks began to appear. And through those cracks came art, poetry, rebellion, and truth. Writers like Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman began to reveal the emotional lives of women in all their complexity. They wrote of isolation, pressure, and the quiet wars fought inside the heart. Their words became the new medicine, the kind that healed not through denial, but through honesty. And slowly, the world began to understand that the cure for hysteria was never in the doctor's office. It was in the act of being heard. For centuries, women had been patients in their own lives, studied, examined, and explained by others. But in the modern age, they began to write their own prescriptions. Freedom, education, expression, choice. They began to define what health really meant, not calmness or obedience, but wholeness. Wholeness means the right to feel everything, the right to be angry and soft, the right to be still and wild, logical and emotional, strong and gentle, all at once. And that is what hysteria tried to erase, because to feel deeply is to be fully alive. And that kind of aliveness cannot be controlled. Imagine, for a moment, one of those women from the 1880s, her hair pinned tight, her dress heavy, her heart restless. She sits by the fire, staring into the flickering light, wondering why she feels so trapped when she has everything society says she should want. A comfortable home, a husband, fine things. And yet, something in her whispers that this isn't life, it's a kind of sleep. A polite, gilded prison, the doctor calls it hysteria. But what she feels is hunger, not for food, but for meaning, a hunger for freedom, for the right to breathe without asking permission. And in that quiet rebellion, in that longing, lies the beginning of change. Because history is not only written by the powerful. Sometimes it's written by the powerless, in silence, in patience, in endurance. Every woman who refused to be cured of her emotions helped cure the world of its blindness. And that is the hidden beauty of this story, that from absurdity came awareness, from oppression came awakening. The shocking Victorian cure for hysteria, that strange, almost comical idea that pleasure was a prescription, ended up being the start of something profound. It forced people to ask uncomfortable questions. What is desire? What is emotion? And why do we fear them? In time, those questions became the seeds of modern psychology, of women's liberation, of self-understanding itself. The story of hysteria teaches us that when emotion is denied, it doesn't disappear, it simply finds another way to speak. And when people are silenced long enough, their truth always finds its voice, sometimes through art, sometimes through protest, sometimes through history's quiet revenge. Every age believes it understands the human heart. Every age also fears it. But emotion is the oldest language on earth. It existed before science, before religion, before words. It lives in the pulse, in the breath, in the unspoken. And that's why the Victorians could never truly cure hysteria, because they were never fighting a disease. They were fighting the very essence of being human. To feel deeply is not a flaw, it is the proof that we are alive. Tonight, as the room grows darker and the world slows down, imagine all those voices across time, the ones called hysterical, emotional, unstable. They are whispering still, softly, across the centuries. They are saying, do not be ashamed of your feelings, do not fear your own heart, do not mistake your passion for illness, because what they called hysteria was never madness. It was the echo of freedom, trapped inside a cage, and now, the cage is open. The world has changed, the fire has burned low. And as you drift towards sleep, remember this simple truth, that every feeling has a reason, and every emotion has a right to exist. The story they never taught in history class is not just about an illness or a strange cure. It's about awakening, about the long journey from silence to speech, from shame to understanding, from being seen as sick to being seen as human. So close your eyes, let the soft hum of history fade into quiet, and think of all those forgotten hearts who dared to feel. They are part of you, too. And the cure, after all this time, was never about fixing anyone. It was about listening. It was about understanding. It was about finally saying, I believe you.